The gunshot that ended Marshal Tom Hendricks' life in the summer of 1883 left Bennett Quinlan alone in a world that didn't forgive men who hesitated. And he'd hesitated just long enough to watch his partner fall before returning fire. The badge that once meant something now weighed heavy in his saddlebag as he rode into Victor, Colorado, leading a chestnut mare whose previous owner wouldn't need her anymore. His own horse Storm carrying him through the mountain pass, like they'd been doing for the better part of a week since leaving Denver. Bennett had killed the man who shot Tom, but vengeance tasted like ash and did nothing to fill the hollow space where his friends' laughter used to echo during long nights on the trail. Victor sat nestled in the mountains at nearly 10,000 feet, a gold mining town that had sprung up just 2 years prior when the precious metal was discovered in the hills. The main street sprawled wide and dusty between false-fronted buildings that still smelled of fresh cut pine, and the sound of hammers against nails competed with the stamp mills that worked day and night processing ore. Bennett guided Storm down the center of the street, passing miners with dirt-caked faces and businessmen in suits that looked out of place against the raw wilderness surrounding them. His stomach had been empty since yesterday morning, but Storm needed water and feed first, always first, and Bennett wouldn't even think about his own hunger until his horse was cared for. The livery stable stood at the south end of town, a substantial structure built to withstand the harsh mountain winters that could bury a man in snow from October through May. Bennett dismounted, his legs stiff from days in the saddle, and led both horses through the wide doors into the dim interior that smelled of hay and leather and horse sweat. An older man with a gray beard looked up from mucking a stall, squinting at Bennett with the cautious assessment of someone who'd seen too many drifters pass through. "Need stalls for 2, Bennett said, his voice rough from disuse. "The mare's for sale if you know anyone interested. She's sound and well-trained." "I'll take a look at her," the liveryman said, setting aside his pitchfork. "Name's Gerald Hutchins. I run this place with my daughter." Bennett nodded, already moving to unsaddle Storm, his hands working automatically through the familiar motions. He removed the saddle and blanket, noting the sweat marks on Storm's dark coat, then began rubbing the horse down with handfuls of straw. The gelding nickered softly, pressing his nose against Bennett's chest in a gesture of trust that made something twist in Bennett's chest. This horse had carried him through gunfights and blizzards, across deserts and through rivers, never faltering, never complaining, and Bennett would see him fed and watered before he took a single bite of food himself. "You care for your animals proper," Gerald observed, watching Bennett work. "That's good to see. Too many men treat their horses like they're nothing more than transportation." "A horse like Storm is worth more than most men I've met," Bennett said quietly, leading the gelding to a stall with fresh straw. He hung a feed bag of oats around Storm's neck, then filled the water bucket from the pump. Only after Storm was eating contentedly did Bennett turn his attention to the mare, repeating the process with the same careful attention to detail. The sound of footsteps made him turn, and Bennett found himself looking at a woman who carried a basket filled with what looked like bread and wrapped parcels. She was somewhere in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and brown eyes that assessed him with frank curiosity. She wore a simple calico dress covered by an apron, and there was flour dusted on one sleeve like she'd come straight from baking. "Papa, I brought lunch," she said, then noticed Bennett. "Oh, we have a customer. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." "No interruption, miss," Bennett said, removing his hat. "I was just getting my horses settled." "This is my daughter, Naomi," Gerald said with obvious pride. "Naomi, this is." He trailed off, realizing Bennett hadn't introduced himself. Bennett Quinlan, Bennett supplied. Naomi's gaze shifted to the horses, and Bennett saw her frown slightly. "Mr. Quinlan, when did these horses last eat?" "Yesterday morning," Bennett admitted. "We've been traveling hard." "And when did you last eat?" she asked, her tone taking on an edge that reminded Bennett uncomfortably of his mother. Bennett didn't answer, which was answer enough. Naomi's frown deepened, and she set her basket down on a barrel with a decisive thump. "Papa, would you get Mr. Quinlan some fresh water from the pump? And I'll need that crate over there to sit on." "Naomi, I'm fine," Bennett protested, but his stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, betraying him. "You're not fine," Naomi said firmly, unpacking her basket with brisk efficiency. "A man who looks after his animals before himself is admirable, Mr. Quinlan, but there's a difference between being responsible and being foolish. You can't take care of your horses if you collapse from hunger." She produced a loaf of bread that still looked warm, along with cold chicken wrapped in cloth, a jar of preserves, and a wedge of cheese. Gerald returned with a tin cup of water, fighting back a smile as his daughter arranged the food on top of the crate like she was setting a proper table. Bennett found himself guided to sit on a hay bale, and before he could form another protest, Naomi had thrust a thick slice of bread spread with preserves into his hand. "Eat," she commanded. "And your horses need more than just oats if they've been working that hard." "Papa, we have molasses, don't we? Mix some in with warm water. It'll help them recover their strength faster." Gerald moved to comply, and Bennett bit into the bread because arguing seemed futile and because the smell was making his mouth water. The preserves were strawberry, sweet and tart at the same time, and the bread was the best thing he'd tasted in weeks. Naomi watched him with satisfaction, then began preparing plates for both her father and herself, though she made sure Bennett's portions were noticeably larger. "You're traveling alone?" she asked, settling onto another hay bale with her own modest lunch. "I am now," Bennett said, the words coming out harder than he intended. Naomi's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry. Was it recent? Week ago, more or less." Bennett took a drink of water, washing down the bread. "My partner. We were marshals out of Denver." Gerald returned from mixing the molasses water for the horses, and Storm drank deeply, his ears pricked forward with appreciation. "You're lawmen?" the older man asked, settling down to his own lunch. "Was," Bennett corrected. "Badge doesn't mean much when you can't protect the people who matter." They ate in companionable silence for a while, broken only by the sounds of horses eating and the distant clamor of the town outside. Bennett found himself studying Naomi when he thought she wasn't looking, noticing the way she moved with practiced efficiency. How her hands were work roughened but gentle when she reached out to stroke Storm's nose through the stall bars. The gelding, who was usually standoffish with strangers, accepted her touch without protest. "He likes you," Bennett observed. "Storm doesn't warm up to people easily." "Horses know when someone means them well," Naomi said simply. "And this is a good horse. I can see it in his eyes." She glanced at Bennett. "Are you staying in Victor or just passing through?" "Haven't decided yet," Bennett admitted. The truth was he had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting distance between himself and the memories that haunted him. "Depends on whether there's work to be had." Gerald exchanged a look with his daughter. "The town could use a man with law experience," he said carefully. "We've got a sheriff, Bob Pritchard, but he's older and could use a deputy. The mining brings in all sorts, and not all of them are decent folks." "I'll think about it," Bennett said, though the idea of pinning on another badge made his chest tighten. He finished the chicken Naomi had given him, savoring every bite, then helped himself to the cheese when she pushed it toward him with a meaningful look. "Where are you staying tonight?" Naomi asked. The hotel on Main Street is clean and reasonable. Mrs. Patterson runs it and she's honest about her prices. I'll find something, Bennett said. He stood, brushing crumbs from his trousers. Thank you for the meal, Miss Naomi. I appreciate the kindness. You can pay me back by coming to dinner tomorrow, Naomi said, the words coming out like a challenge. Papa and I live in the house just behind the livery. 6 o'clock. And don't you dare show up having not eaten all day again. Bennett found himself agreeing before he quite knew what he was doing. Something in Naomi's fierce concern breaking through the walls he'd built around himself since Tom died. He paid Gerald for 3 days of stabling, including extra for the good care of his horses, and collected his saddlebags and rifle. The chestnut mare would stay at the livery until a buyer could be found, and Bennett didn't mention that the money from her sale would probably go toward Storm's feed rather than his own lodging. The hotel Naomi had recommended turned out to be exactly as described, a neat 2-story building with whitewashed walls and lace curtains in the windows. Mrs. Patterson was a bird-like woman in her 50s who showed Bennett to a second-floor room with a real bed and a basin for washing. The price was fair, and Bennett paid for a week in advance, figuring that gave him time to decide whether Victor would be a place he stayed or just another town he passed through on his way to nowhere in particular. He spent the rest of the day walking the streets of Victor, learning the layout of the town and observing the people who called it home. The mining operations dominated everything, with the Independence Mine and the Portland Mine both working full crews. Miners poured into the saloons when their shifts ended, spending their wages on whiskey and card games, and Bennett noted the tension that ran through certain groups like an underground current. There were the usual divisions, Americans and immigrants, company men and independent prospectors, those who'd struck it rich, and those still chasing the dream. Sheriff Pritchard turned out to be a heavy-set man in his 60s with kind eyes and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. Bennett found him making rounds, checking that the businesses were secure as evening settled over the town, and introduced himself without mentioning his past as a marshal. They talked for a while about nothing in particular, just the sort of conversation men have when they're measuring each other, and Bennett got the impression that Pritchard was exactly the sort of lawman who kept a town running through fairness and common sense rather than fear. That night, lying in a bed that felt too soft after weeks on the ground, Bennett stared at the ceiling and thought about Naomi Newton. There was something about her directness that appealed to him, the way she'd looked at him and seen not just a drifter or a potential problem, but a man who needed feeding. She'd cared about Storm's well-being as much as his own, understanding instinctively what Bennett had always known, that a man who neglected his horse was no kind of man at all. He'd met beautiful women before, women who knew how to flutter their eyelashes and make a man feel like he was special, but there was something different about Naomi. She didn't flutter or simper. She just looked at you straight on and told you what she thought, and Bennett realized he found that more attractive than any amount of artifice. The next day passed slowly. Bennett sold the chestnut mare to a merchant who needed a reliable mount for his wife, getting a fair price that he immediately used to purchase a month's worth of premium feed for Storm at the livery. Gerald accepted the order with a knowing smile, and Bennett suspected the man understood exactly what motivated him. He spent the afternoon helping repair a section of fence at the livery that had been damaged by a spooked horse, working with his hands in a way that felt good after so much time in the saddle. Physical labor had always helped quiet his mind, and the rhythm of hammering nails and stretching wire gave him space to breathe without thinking about Tom or the future or anything beyond the immediate task. At 5:30, After washing up at the hotel and changing into his cleanest shirt, Bennett made his way to the house behind the livery. It was a modest structure, well maintained with a small garden where vegetables grew in neat rows. He could smell something cooking even before he knocked, something savory that made his mouth water despite his intention to show up less desperately hungry than yesterday. Naomi opened the door, and Bennett was struck by how different she looked with her hair down, falling in dark waves past her shoulders. She still wore an apron over her dress, but she'd clearly made an effort, and there was a flush to her cheeks that might have been from cooking or might have been something else. "You came," she said, sounding pleased, "and you look like you've eaten today." "I had breakfast," Bennett confirmed, which was true even if it had only been coffee and a roll from the hotel. "Well, come in then. Papa's washing up, but dinner's almost ready." The interior of the house was cozy, furnished simply but with obvious care. A table was set for three, with real china plates and cloth napkins, and Bennett felt suddenly awkward, like he'd forgotten how to behave in civilized company. Naomi seemed to sense his discomfort because she guided him to sit down and immediately handed him a basket of fresh bread rolls, giving him something to do with his hands. Gerald emerged from the back room, his beard still damp, and clapped Bennett on the shoulder in greeting. "Good to see you again, son. Naomi's been cooking all afternoon. Hope you brought an appetite." "I did," Bennett said, and it was true. The smell of whatever Naomi had prepared was making his stomach wake up in ways it hadn't for days. She brought out a roast chicken, perfectly golden, along with potatoes and carrots that had clearly come from her garden, and a gravy that was rich and savory. Bennett couldn't remember the last time he'd sat down to a proper family dinner, and something about the normality of it made his throat tight. They said grace, Gerald's voice warm and sincere, and then Naomi was heaping food onto Bennett's plate with the same determination she'd shown at the livery. "So tell me, Mr. Quinlan," she said as they began eating, "what made you become a marshal?" Bennett cut into his chicken, buying himself a moment to think. "My father was a sheriff back in Kansas," he said finally. "Grew up thinking lawmen were the ones who stood between good people and chaos. Seemed like important work. Was," Naomi picked up on the past tense, "is your father no longer alive? He died when I was 17. Influenza took him and my mother both same winter." Bennett had long since made peace with that loss, though it still ached in the quiet moments. "My sister went to live with our aunt in St. Louis. I was old enough to be on my own, so I headed west and ended up getting hired as a deputy in a town outside Dodge City." "That's where you met your partner?" Gerald asked gently. Bennett nodded. "Tom Hendricks." "He was older, had been marshalling for years. Taught me everything that mattered. How to read a situation before it turned violent, when to draw and when to talk. He was a good man." The words came easier than he'd expected, maybe because Gerald and Naomi listened without judgment or false sympathy. "We worked together for 6 years. Got transferred to Denver last year because they needed experienced men who could handle the rough element." "What happened to him?" Naomi asked quietly. "Bank robbery," Bennett said flatly. 3 men, all armed. We responded and Tom went in first like he always did. The youngest robber panicked and fired. Tom went down and He stopped, the memory still too fresh, still too raw. "I killed the shooter. The other 2 surrendered, but Tom bled out before the doctor could get there." Naomi reached across the table and placed her hand over his, the gesture so simple and genuine that Bennett felt something crack in his chest. "I'm sorry," she said. "Truly sorry. That kind of loss isn't something you get over quickly." "I don't know if I get over it at all," Bennett admitted. "I just know I couldn't stay in Denver, couldn't keep wearing the badge, so I left." They sat in silence for a moment, and then Gerald cleared his throat. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Consumption. Took her slow, which was almost worse than if it had been sudden. Naomi nursed her through the whole thing, never complained, never left her side. After Eliza passed, I didn't think I'd ever feel right again. But time helps, even when you think it won't, and having purpose helps more. Papa needed the livery," Naomi added softly. "Something to focus on besides the loss. And I found that cooking for people, taking care of them, it helped me too. Made me feel like I was doing something good in a world that had felt pretty dark." Bennett understood what they were offering him, this shared recognition of grief and the slow path through it. He squeezed Naomi's hand briefly before releasing it, then applied himself to his dinner with renewed focus. The food was exceptional, every bite perfectly seasoned and cooked with obvious skill, and he told Naomi so between mouthfuls. She smiled, that flush returning to her cheeks. "I'm glad you like it. Cooking's one of the few things I'm really good at. Well, that and dealing with horses. From what I saw yesterday, you're good at dealing with stubborn men too," Bennett said, surprising himself with the teasing tone. Naomi laughed, a bright sound that made something warm bloom in Bennett's chest. "That's just practice from handling Papa all these years." "Hey now," Gerald protested, but he was grinning. "I'm not that stubborn. You argued with me for 3 days about seeing the doctor when you hurt your back," Naomi pointed out. "You're exactly that stubborn." They fell into easy conversation, talk flowing naturally from topic to topic. Gerald told stories about some of the more memorable horses that had come through the livery, including a mule that had learned to open its stall door and regularly escaped to raid the feed room. Naomi shared her plans for expanding the garden next spring, maybe adding some berry bushes if she could find good stock. Bennett found himself talking more than he had in weeks, drawn out by their genuine interest and the comfortable atmosphere they'd created. After dinner, Naomi produced an apple pie that was still warm from the oven, the crust flaky and golden, the filling sweet and tart with cinnamon. Bennett ate 2 slices and would have accepted a third if Naomi had offered, but she was laughing at his expression of contentment and told him he needed to save room for next time. "Next time," he echoed. "Well, you can't expect me to feed you this well just once and then send you back to hotel meals," Naomi said matter-of-factly. "You're coming to dinner again. Sunday, if you're free." Bennett should have made excuses. Should have explained that he wasn't planning to stay in Victor long-term, that getting attached to people or places was dangerous when you'd already lost so much. But instead he found himself agreeing, seduced by the promise of more evenings like this one, more of Naomi's cooking and her father's quiet wisdom, and the feeling of being part of something that resembled family. He helped wash the dishes over Naomi's protests, standing beside her at the basin while Gerald dozed in his chair by the fire. Their hands bumped occasionally in the soapy water, and Bennett found himself hyper-aware of her presence, the way she hummed softly while she worked, the curve of her neck where her hair fell forward. When the last plate was dried and put away, Naomi walked him to the door and they stood there for a moment in the gathering darkness. "Thank you," Bennett said, "for the meal and the company. It meant more than you probably realize." "I'm glad you came," Naomi replied. She looked up at him, her expression serious. "You seem like a good man, Bennett Quinlan, the kind who puts others first even when it costs him. But you need to remember to take care of yourself too. Your horse needs you healthy and whole." "Is that the only reason I should take care of myself?" Bennett asked, emboldened by the darkness and the warmth still lingering from dinner. Naomi smiled, slow and knowing. "Maybe not the only reason, but it's a good place to start." She stepped back before he could say anything else. Good night, Bennett. I'll see you Sunday. He walked back to the hotel in a daze, his stomach full and his mind clearer than it had been since Tom's death. That night he slept without nightmares for the first time in a week, and when he woke the next morning, he found himself thinking about Naomi's smile instead of the sound of gunfire. The days until Sunday passed in a new rhythm. Bennett spent his mornings with Storm, sometimes riding out into the hills to explore the country around Victor, sometimes just grooming the horse and checking his shoes and tack. The gelding seemed to sense Bennett's improving mood, becoming more playful, nipping at Bennett's sleeve and tossing his head when he wanted attention. In the afternoons, Bennett found himself volunteering for odd jobs around town, helping the blacksmith with some heavy work, assisting at the general store when a shipment came in, even spending a day helping build a new schoolhouse on the edge of town. He ran into Naomi frequently, Victor being small enough that avoiding someone took more effort than encountering them. She always stopped to talk, asking after Storm and making sure Bennett was eating properly, and gradually their conversations stretched longer, moving beyond surface pleasantries into real exchanges. He learned that she'd been born in Ohio, that her family had moved west when she was 12 following her father's dream of running his own business. She'd been engaged once, to a miner who died in a cave-in 3 years ago, and the loss had made her cautious about opening her heart again. But cautious doesn't mean closed, she told Bennett one afternoon when they crossed paths at the general store. I still believe in the possibility of love. I just think it should be built on something real, not just pretty words and promises. Bennett understood that philosophy completely. He'd seen too many rushed marriages fall apart when the initial passion faded, and there was nothing substantial underneath to hold the couple together. What he was starting to feel for Naomi was different, rooted in respect and genuine liking, and he found himself wanting to know everything about her, from her favorite season to her opinion on whether Colorado would ever become a state. Sunday arrived with perfect mountain weather, the sky impossibly blue and the air crisp with the promise of autumn. Bennett arrived at the Newton house promptly at 6, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked during a morning ride. Naomi accepted them with obvious delight, her whole face lighting up in a way that made Bennett want to find her flowers every day for the rest of his life. Dinner was another triumph, a pot roast that fell apart at the touch of a fork, with vegetables that had absorbed all the rich flavors of the meat and broth. Gerald had opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving, and they toasted to new friendships and fresh starts. The conversation flowed even more easily than before, lubricated by good food and growing comfort with each other. Bennett told stories about his years as a lawman, the funny incidents as well as the serious ones, and Gerald shared memories of his early days in Ohio, working in his father's livery before striking out on his own. After dinner, Gerald excused himself to do evening rounds at the livery, leaving Bennett and Naomi alone with a knowing smile that made his daughter blush. They settled on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, and Naomi pointed out constellations while Bennett listened to her voice more than her words. "Can I ask you something?" Naomi said after a while, her tone turning serious. "Anything," Bennett replied. "Are you planning to stay in Victor, or are you still just passing through?" Bennett considered the question carefully. "When I arrived, I was just passing through, didn't have any intention of putting down roots anywhere. But now—" He trailed off, trying to find the right words. "Now I'm thinking maybe Victor could be home if I let it." "What changed?" Naomi asked softly. "You," Bennett said simply. "You and your father. The way you fed me that first day, like you couldn't stand the thought of anyone going hungry while you had food to share." The way you cared about Storm as much as you cared about me. It made me remember what it feels like to be part of something, to matter to someone." Naomi was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "You matter to me, Bennett. More than I probably should admit after knowing you such a short time, but I can't help it. There's something about you that feels right." Bennett reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I feel it too. Scared the hell out of me at first, if I'm being honest. After losing Tom, I didn't think I could handle caring about anyone again, but you make it seem possible. You make everything seem possible." "So you'll stay?" Naomi asked, hope clear in her voice. "I'll stay," Bennett confirmed. "At least long enough to see where this goes, where we go." Naomi squeezed his hand, then stood and pulled him to his feet. "Come here," she said, leading him to the porch railing where they could see the whole spread of Victor below them, lights beginning to glow in windows as families settled in for the evening. "This is a good town, Bennett. Good people trying to build something that lasts. It could use a man like you, someone with experience keeping the peace. And I could use—" She stopped, seeming to gather her courage. "I could use someone who understands that love isn't just about grand gestures and romance. It's about the everyday things, making sure people eat, taking care of the animals that depend on you, building a life together one day at a time." Bennett turned her to face him, cupping her cheek with his free hand. "Is that what you want, to build a life with me?" "I think it might be," Naomi whispered, "if you want the same thing." Instead of answering with words, Bennett kissed her, gentle and careful, giving her every chance to pull away. But Naomi didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck, and kissed him back with a sweetness that made Bennett's heart stutter in his chest. They stood there on the porch, holding each other while the stars wheeled overhead, and Bennett felt the last pieces of his broken heart start to knit back together. Gerald's return interrupted them some time later, his deliberately loud footsteps on the path giving them time to separate before he came into view. The older man took in their flushed faces and linked hands with a satisfied expression, but all he said was, "Getting late." "Bennett, you're welcome to stay for coffee if you'd like." They sat in the parlor drinking coffee and talking about plans for the upcoming winter, which Gerald assured Bennett would be fierce at this altitude. The livery would need additional hay stored, and firewood would have to be cut and stacked. Bennett found himself volunteering to help with both tasks, already thinking of Victor as his town, these people as his people. When he finally left for the hotel, well past midnight, Naomi walked him to the gate and kissed him again, softer and briefer than before but no less meaningful. "See you tomorrow?" she asked. "Try to keep me away," Bennett replied. The next morning, Bennett went to see Sheriff Pritchard and asked about the deputy position. The sheriff's face broke into a wide grin, and he admitted he'd been hoping Bennett would come around eventually. The pay wasn't much, but it came with a small house on the edge of town and the respect of the community. Bennett accepted on the spot, and just like that, his drifting days were over. He had a job, a purpose, and a woman who made him want to be the best version of himself. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that felt like happiness. Bennett took to his deputy duties with the dedication he'd always brought to law work, but this time without the darkness that had shadowed his years with Tom. He broke up fights in the saloons, mediated disputes between miners, and rode circuit to the smaller mining camps scattered in the hills around Victor. Sheriff Pritchard proved to be an excellent teacher in a different way than Tom had been, showing Bennett that keeping the peace was as much about knowing your community as it was about fast draw or good aim. And through it all, there was Naomi. She packed him lunch every day, always including something for Storm, carrots or apples or sugar cubes wrapped in paper. Bennett would stop by the livery on his rounds, and they'd eat together in Storm's stall, talking about everything and nothing while the horse munched contentedly on whatever treat Naomi had brought. In the evenings, Bennett often had dinner with Naomi and Gerald, and sometimes Naomi would walk with him through town afterward, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, discussing their days and making plans for the future that was slowly taking shape. Bennett fell in love the way mountains are formed, gradually and with tremendous force, layer upon layer of feeling building until it was unshakable. He loved the way Naomi hummed while she cooked, always slightly off-key. He loved how she talked to Storm like the horse could understand every word, and how Storm responded to her with the same devotion he showed Bennett. He loved her competence, the way she could manage the livery accounts and gentle a spooked horse and bake bread that made grown men weep, all with equal skill. But mostly he loved her heart, the way she saw people who were hurting and couldn't rest until she'd done something to help. October brought the first serious snow, a storm that dumped 2 feet overnight and shut down the mining operations for 3 days. Bennett spent those days helping dig out the town, checking on elderly residents to make sure they had enough firewood and food, and assisting Gerald in making sure the livery horses stayed warm and fed. Naomi kept a pot of soup going continuously, feeding anyone who stopped by to warm up, and Bennett watched her ladle out bowls with the same care whether she was serving a wealthy mine owner or an out-of-work prospector. On the 3rd night, after the town had been cleared and people were starting to venture out again, Bennett asked Naomi to take a walk with him. They bundled up against the cold, and Bennett led her to the little house that came with his deputy position. He'd been living there for a month now, slowly making it feel like home with furniture purchased from the general store and curtains Naomi had helped him pick out. "I want to show you something," Bennett said, lighting the lamps to reveal the interior. It was clean and tidy, one large room that served as kitchen and living area, with a separate bedroom in the back and a small office space where he kept his law books and paperwork. Naomi looked around with evident approval. "You've made it nice, Bennett. It feels like a real home." "It could be," Bennett said carefully, "with the right person sharing it." Naomi turned to face him, her eyes wide. "Bennett." He took both her hands in his, suddenly nervous despite having faced down armed outlaws without flinching. "I know we haven't known each other long. Not even 3 months yet. But I also know that what I feel for you isn't going to change or fade. You're the best thing that's happened to me in longer than I can remember, Naomi Newton. You fed me when I was hungry, looked after my horse, and somehow saw past all my grief and anger to whatever good was left inside me. I love you, and I'm asking if you'd consider being my wife." Tears spilled down Naomi's cheeks, but she was smiling, that brilliant smile that Bennett had come to crave like sunlight. "Yes," she said, the word coming out half laugh, half sob. "Yes, I'll marry you. I love you too, Bennett Quinlan. I think I started loving you the moment I saw you putting your horse's needs before your own, and knew you were the kind of man worth keeping." Bennett pulled her into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, pouring all his love and hope and relief into the embrace. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Naomi was laughing and crying at the same time, and Bennett felt lighter than he had in years. They told Gerald that night, and the older man embraced them both with tears in his eyes. "I couldn't ask for a better man for my daughter," he said to Bennett. "And I know Eliza would have loved you. She always said Naomi needed someone who'd appreciate her strength instead of being threatened by it." "I appreciate everything about her," Bennett said honestly. "She's the strongest person I know." They decided on a December wedding, giving them time to prepare but not so long that they had to wait through the harsh mountain winter. The town embraced the news with enthusiasm, everyone eager to celebrate something joyful in a place where life was often hard and uncertain. The church ladies organized a quilting bee to make bedding for the newlyweds, and the miners took up a collection to buy them a proper iron stove. Sheriff Pritchard gave Bennett 3 days off for a honeymoon, joking that it was more time off than he'd taken in 20 years of law work. Bennett used the weeks before the wedding to make the house perfect for Naomi. He built shelves for her books and her mother's china, installed hooks by the door for coats and scarves, and constructed a chicken coop in the backyard so she could keep hens like she'd always wanted. Gerald helped him build a small barn for Storm and any other horses they might acquire, and Bennett made sure there was a workroom where Naomi could pursue her cooking without being cramped. Naomi, for her part, sewed curtains and tablecloths, embroidered pillowcases, and filled jars with preserves and pickled vegetables to stock their pantry. She moved through the preparations with quiet joy, and Bennett caught her sometimes just standing in the house, running her hand over a piece of furniture or a wall, like she couldn't quite believe it was real. "What are you thinking?" he asked one evening, finding her in the kitchen area, her hand on the new stove. "I'm thinking about all the meals I'm going to cook here," she said softly. "All the mornings we'll have coffee together before you go on rounds. All the evenings we'll sit by the fire and talk about our days. I'm thinking about building a life with you, Bennett, and how lucky I am that you rode into Victor when you did." "I'm the lucky one," Bennett said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "You saved me, Naomi. I was so lost when I got here, so broken. And you put me back together just by being yourself." "We saved each other," Naomi corrected, leaning back against him. "That's what love does. It makes us whole." The wedding took place on a crystal-clear December morning, the sun brilliant on the snow-covered peaks surrounding Victor. The church was packed with what seemed like the entire town, miners and merchants and families all crowded into the pews. Naomi walked down the aisle on her father's arm, wearing a dress of deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, with her mother's cameo pinned at her throat. Bennett stood at the altar in his best suit, the one he'd worn for formal occasions when he was still a marshal, and felt his throat close with emotion as she approached. Gerald placed Naomi's hand in Bennett's with a gentle squeeze, his eyes suspiciously bright. The minister, a kind-faced man named Reverend Walsh, led them through the traditional vows, and Bennett meant every word with his whole heart. When he slid the gold band onto Naomi's finger, a ring he'd had specially made by the town's jeweler, she looked up at him with such love that Bennett felt blessed beyond measure. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Walsh announced. "Bennett, you may kiss your bride." Bennett did, tenderly and thoroughly, while the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. They walked back down the aisle together, Naomi's hand tucked into Bennett's arm, and emerged into the winter sunshine as man and wife. A celebration followed at the hotel, with food and dancing and more good wishes than Bennett could count. He danced with Naomi until his feet hurt, held her close during the slow songs, and laughed more than he had in years. As evening fell, they slipped away to their house, now officially their shared home. Bennett carried Naomi over the threshold despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of walking, and set her down in the middle of their front room. A fire was already burning in the hearth, courtesy of Gerald, who'd stopped by earlier, and the lamps cast a warm glow over everything. "Welcome home, Mrs. Quinlan," Bennett said softly. "Welcome home, Mr. Quinlan," Naomi replied, reaching up to cup his face. "I love you." "I love you too," Bennett said, "now and always." They made love that night with tenderness and care, learning each other's bodies and building new memories to replace old sorrows. Afterward, Lying tangled together in their marriage bed, Naomi traced patterns on Bennett's chest and told him all her dreams for their future. Children, maybe 3 or 4 if they were blessed. A bigger garden in the spring, eventually expanding the house to add more rooms. Growing old together in Victor, becoming the kind of couple young people looked at and thought, "That's what I want." Bennett listened and added his own dreams to hers, surprised to find he had so many after spending months thinking he had no future at all. He wanted to be the best deputy Victor had ever seen, maybe even sheriff someday when Pritchard retired. He wanted to give Naomi the kind of life where she never worried about having enough, where she could cook and care for people because it brought her joy, not because circumstances forced it. He wanted to raise children who understood the value of hard work and kindness. And he wanted to grow old with this woman in his arms, the one who'd seen him at his lowest and loved him anyway. Winter deepened, bringing storms that isolated Victor for days at a time, but inside their house, Bennett and Naomi created a world that was warm and safe and full of love. They developed routines, small domestic rituals that anchored their days. Bennett always woke first, stoking the fire and starting coffee before heading out to tend Storm. Naomi would join him at the barn, no matter how cold it was, bringing oats mixed with molasses for the horse and making sure he had fresh water. They'd return to the house together for breakfast, and Bennett always waited until Storm was fed before he ate his own meal, a habit Naomi encouraged because she understood it was part of who he was. "You're a good man," she told him one morning, watching him give Storm an extra apple. "Taking care of the animals that depend on you, putting their needs first. It's one of the things I love most about you. You take care of both of us," Bennett pointed out. "You make sure Storm gets his treats and I get my meals. We'd both be lost without you." "Then it's lucky you found me," Naomi said with a smile. "Or I found you. However it happened, I'm grateful." As winter gave way to spring, Naomi discovered she was pregnant. She told Bennett over dinner, saying the words casually like she was commenting on the weather, and then laughing at his stunned expression. Bennett whooped with joy, lifted her out of her chair, and spun her around the kitchen while she protested that he'd make her dizzy. They celebrated with Gerald that night. The older man moved to tears at the prospect of becoming a grandfather. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, Naomi blooming with health, despite the nausea that plagued her first few months. Bennett became even more protective, constantly checking on her and trying to take over her chores. Naomi tolerated this for about a week before sitting him down and firmly explaining that being pregnant didn't make her an invalid. She could still cook and tend the chickens and walk to the livery to visit her father. What she needed from Bennett was his love and support, not his hovering. Bennett tried to pull back, he really did, but he couldn't help bringing her flowers and making sure she put her feet up in the evenings, and generally treating her like she was made of spun glass. Naomi bore it with good humor, seeming to understand that Bennett's protectiveness came from love and perhaps a lingering fear of loss. She made sure he knew she was strong and healthy, that women had been having babies since the dawn of time, but she also let him fuss over her when he needed to, recognizing it as his way of expressing care. Summer arrived, bringing longer days and the bustle of mining season in full swing. Victor had grown significantly in the year since Bennett arrived, new buildings going up and more families settling in the area. Bennett's reputation as a fair and competent lawman had spread, and even the rougher element respected him. He'd had to draw his gun a few times, but he'd never had to fire it, and he was grateful for that. He'd seen enough death to last a lifetime. In August, Naomi gave birth to a son they named Thomas Gerald Quinlan, honoring both Bennett's lost partner and Naomi's father. The birth was difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and Bennett spent the entire time pacing in the parlor while the midwife and doctor attended to Naomi. When he finally heard his son's first cry, Bennett dropped into a chair and wept with relief and joy and gratitude that both mother and child had survived. Naomi was exhausted but radiant when Bennett was allowed in to meet his son. She placed the tiny bundle in his arms, and Bennett looked down at Thomas's red, wrinkled face and felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were possible. This was his son, his and Naomi's, a new life they'd created together. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, but it felt right and good. "He's perfect," Bennett whispered. "You're perfect. God, Naomi, I don't have words for what I'm feeling right now." "I know," Naomi said softly, reaching up to touch his face. "I feel it too. We made a person, Bennett. A whole new person who's going to grow up and have his own life and dreams. It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time." Gerald met his grandson with tears streaming down his weathered face, holding Thomas with the practiced care of someone who remembered doing this with his own daughter years ago. "He has Eliza's nose," he said wonderingly. "And your stubborn chin, Naomi. This boy's going to be a handful." "Good," Bennett said. "The world needs more people with backbone." They settled into the chaos of new parenthood, nights punctuated by feeding and diaper changes, days structured around Thomas's needs. Bennett learned to function on minimal sleep, catching naps when he could between rounds. Naomi nursed their son while managing the household with the same competence she brought to everything. And through it all, Bennett made sure to maintain his old habits, rising early to feed Storm before he fed himself. Though now Naomi would be nursing Thomas while Bennett ate breakfast, the three of them starting the day together. "You're still putting that horse first," Naomi teased him one morning, watching him wolf down eggs so he could get back to Storm's morning grooming. "Storm took care of me when I had nothing," Bennett said seriously. "He carried me through some of the darkest days of my life and never let me down. I owe him everything, including making sure he's fed and cared for before I worry about my own comfort." "I know," Naomi said, her expression softening. "It's one of the many reasons I love you. You're loyal to those who depend on you. Storm, me, Thomas, the town. You show up and do what needs doing, no matter what." The years that followed were full in the best possible way. Thomas grew from infant to toddler to little boy, full of energy and curiosity and his mother's determination. Bennett taught him to ride as soon as he was big enough to sit a horse, and Storm proved as patient with the child as he'd always been with Bennett. Naomi gave birth to a daughter, Rebecca, when Thomas was 3, and then another son, Jonathan, 2 years after that. Their house expanded with additions to accommodate the growing family, and the barn grew too, as Bennett acquired more horses for work and breeding. Bennett eventually became sheriff when Pritchard retired, and he served Victor with the same integrity and dedication his father had shown back in Kansas. Naomi became known throughout the region for her cooking, and she started a small business baking bread and pies for the hotel and restaurant. The money wasn't much, but it gave her something of her own, and Bennett encouraged her to pursue any dream that brought her joy. Gerald lived long enough to see all 3 grandchildren, to teach Thomas the business of running a livery, and to tell Rebecca stories about her grandmother Eliza. He passed peacefully in his sleep at 72, and they buried him next to his wife with half the town in attendance. Bennett and Naomi mourned him deeply, but they also celebrated the full life he'd lived and the legacy he'd left in his daughter and grandchildren. The Wild West changed around them as years turned to decades. Colorado achieved statehood in 1876, 8 years before Bennett ever reached Victor, but the territory continued to evolve. Railroads connected the mining towns, bringing more people and commerce. The rough edges of frontier life slowly smoothed out as civilization took firmer hold. But some things remained constant. Bennett still fed Storm before himself every morning, a ritual that grounded him no matter how hectic life became. And Naomi still made sure both man and horse were well cared for, packing lunches for Bennett's rounds and treats for Storm. Her love expressed in the everyday acts of feeding and tending. Storm lived to the remarkable age of 30, finally passing away peacefully in his stall with Bennett at his side. Bennett grieved the horse as deeply as he'd grieve a human friend, recognizing that Storm had been his salvation during the darkest time of his life. They buried him on a hill overlooking Victor, and Bennett planted a tree there, a sapling that would grow tall and strong, providing shade and shelter for generations to come. Thomas followed his father into law enforcement, becoming a deputy under Bennett's guidance. Rebecca married a teacher who came west to work at Victor's growing school system, and they gave Bennett and Naomi 4 grandchildren. Jonathan took over what had been Gerald's livery, expanding it into a full stable and horse trading operation that prospered as the town grew. Bennett and Naomi marked their 25th wedding anniversary in the same church where they'd spoken their vows, renewing their commitment to each other in front of children and grandchildren and friends they'd made over a quarter-century. Bennett looked at his wife, her hair now threaded with silver, and loved her even more than he had on their wedding day. She'd been his partner in every sense of the word, standing beside him through difficulties and joys, raising their children with wisdom and patience, and still, after all these years, making sure he and whatever horse he was riding were fed and cared for. "I'd do it all again," Bennett told her that night as they lay in bed, their familiar positions worn into the mattress over decades. "Every moment, every choice that led me to you, I'd do it all exactly the same." "Even the hard parts?" Naomi asked, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Losing Tom, riding into Victor with nothing but grief and a horse. Even those," Bennett confirmed. "Because they brought me here, to you. To this life we've built. I was lost, Naomi, and you found me. You saw a man who needed feeding and you fed him. You saw a horse that needed care and you cared for it. And somehow in doing those simple, practical things, you saved my life." "We saved each other," Naomi said, echoing words she'd spoken on their wedding day. "That's what love does, Bennett. It sees what's needed and provides it. You needed a home and a purpose. I needed someone who understood that love is shown in everyday actions, not just pretty words. We fit together." "We do," Bennett agreed. "Perfectly." They grew old together in Victor, becoming the kind of couple young people looked at and thought about when they imagined lasting love. Bennett served as sheriff until he was 65, then retired to spend more time with Naomi and their ever-expanding family. They traveled some, taking the train to San Francisco to see the ocean, visiting Denver to see how much it had changed since Bennett's Marshal days. But they always came back to Victor, to the mountains and the community, and the house where they'd raised their children. Naomi's health began to fail when she was 71, her heart growing weak despite her stubborn refusal to slow down. Bennett nursed her through it with the same devotion she'd always shown him, and their children and grandchildren took turns sitting with them, nobody wanting Naomi to face any moment alone. She died on a spring morning, the mountains visible through their bedroom window, with Bennett holding her hand and their children gathered around. "I love you," Bennett whispered. "Then and now and always." "Love you too," Naomi breathed, her voice barely audible. "Take care of yourself, Bennett Quinlan. Don't forget to eat." And then she was gone, slipping away as peacefully as a sigh. Bennett held her for a long time, memorizing her face one last time, grateful beyond words for the 47 years they'd had together. He lived another 5 years without her. Years filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with watching Victor continue to evolve, with serving as the elder statesman everyone came to for advice and stories about the old days. He still kept horses, though his children did most of the actual care now, and he still maintained the habit of feeding them before he fed himself. It was a ritual that connected him to Storm, to those early days when a horse and a woman had saved him from despair, and he couldn't imagine abandoning it. Bennett Quinlan died at 76, in his sleep, in the house he'd shared with Naomi for nearly 5 decades. They buried him beside her on the hill overlooking Victor, and the whole town turned out for the funeral, paying respects to the man who'd helped build their community into something that lasted. His children told stories about how he'd always fed his horses before himself, about how their mother had made sure both man and horse ate well, about the love their parents had shared that had shaped all their lives for the better. Thomas, now sheriff himself, stood at the graveside with his siblings and spoke the final words. "My father once told me that being a good man meant taking care of those who depended on you, whether they walked on 2 legs or 4. He lived that truth every day of his life. And my mother showed us that love was found in the everyday acts of care, in making sure people were fed and warm and knew they mattered. Together, they built something that will last long after we're all gone. They built a family rooted in love and responsibility and kindness, and that's a legacy worth more than gold." The town planted a tree beside Bennett's grave, next to the one that marked Storm's resting place, and over the years those trees grew tall and strong, their branches intertwining overhead, providing shade and shelter for generations of Victor residents who came to remember the sheriff who'd fed his horse before himself, and the woman who'd made sure both man and horse ate well, and the love story that had become legend in the mountains of Colorado.